We've talked in the past about the reasons why a new constitution was needed around the year 1787. James Madison and others were very frustrated with the failings of the Articles of Confederation. Evidence like the rebellion by Daniel Shays in Massachusetts had mounted, showing that the Articles of Confederation were simply too weak and that there is no way that the country would be able to move forward under those articles. So there was a growing consensus, pushed largely by James Madison, who's viewed as the father of the Constitution, but also others, arguing that a stronger document was needed that was going to centralize control and authority in a national government and allow the national government to actually do the things necessary in order to move the country forward. So, in 1787, 55 delegates from each of the states met in Philadelphia, and they began to talk about what they wanted to see in this new government, how they thought it should be organized. It was very controversial. There were a lot of disagreements. But some of the notable people who were there included James Madison, viewed as the father of the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin was one of the elder statesmen who had been around for a really long time, who was very old at this point, but very widely respected by all of the delegates there at the convention. And he was from Pennsylvania, so this was sort of his hometown. George Washington, the general from the Revolutionary War, ends up serving as the chair of the convention, so he helps moderate the discussions and move the conversation forward. A lot of other interesting people were there, but we're not going to focus so much on the people as on the ideas that came out of the convention itself. The goal was to write a constitution. A constitution lays out the plan for government for a particular nation. So the United States Constitution sets up how power is going to be organized, shared, and divided among different parts of the government, and how the government is supposed to operate and make laws. The goal that Madison had is creating an effective government structure in place of what had been, under the Articles of Confederation, a fairly ineffective structure. So, there were several conflicts and disagreements during the course of the delegates' time in Philadelphia. The first major conflict that I'm going to talk to you about is the conflict over representation. Big states and small states simply could not agree. Big states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York had lots of people living there, huge population centers. The majority of population within the new nation lived in these large states. But you also had small states like Delaware and South Carolina and New Jersey and Connecticut. Those smaller states did not have nearly as many people, but they felt that they were also part of this country. They had fought for revolution just like everybody else had. And so you had a conflict between the big states who wanted to base representation on population and the small states, which thought that each state should be equal. So, in a nutshell, big states felt that because we live in a democracy, and we have this idea of one person, one vote, if there are more people in a particular state, that state should simply have more votes in Congress. And the reason is there are more people in that state. And if we give each state equal votes in Congress, then a smaller group of people would have the same power as a larger group of people. And big states were concerned about that. Big states wanted to make sure that population was the basis for representation in Congress. At the same time, the small states feared that big states would always run everything if it was all based on population. So small states floated a different proposal. The Virginia plan said that representation would be based on population. The New Jersey plan, however, suggested, from a small state perspective, that each state should have equal votes. And those were the two questions. Are we going to base representation on population, or are we going to base representation on each state having equal say? This question of representation is critical within a republic because we are choosing the people who are going to make the laws. Those people are going to have a lot of power. What ended up happening is there was a compromise proposed by some delegates from Connecticut, and that compromise came to be known as either the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, and that set up two parts of the legislature. Legislature is what makes the laws, so we have the executive branch where the president operates, the legislative branch, which we now have as a compromise out of this agreement. And the legislative branch is made up of the Senate and the House. The Senate is viewed as the upper chamber. There are 100 members today of the United States Senate because there are 2 members of the Senate from every state. So in the Senate, every state is equal. That satisfied the small states. But in the House of Representatives, every state has representation based on population. So the House of Representatives satisfied the demand for majority rule and population-based representation, a demand made by the big states. They were happy with the House of Representatives structure, and the small states were happy with the Senate. The way that this is combined is by creating a bicameral, or a 2-chambered legislature. The fact of having a bicameral legislature means nothing could happen if the Senate and House disagreed. So you'd have to get the Senate and the House. So the Senate is going to give an advantage to the smaller states. The House is going to give an advantage to the larger states. To get something done in the new nation, you're going to have agreement by both the House and the Senate, and that's the beauty of what's called a bicameral legislature. All right. Then we have another disagreement. This disagreement emphasizes the differences between the northern and southern states. There were some large states in the north, some in the south, some small states in the north, and some in the south. The question of slavery divided these states and divided these delegates upon each other. Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania argued very strongly for abolition of slavery, that we should just eliminate slavery entirely. Some other delegates agreed with Franklin that slavery was immoral, that we needed to get rid of it. If we're talking about freedom and liberty, we're talking about life, liberty, and property as the basis of our new society under the social contract and the Declaration of Independence, we can't justify slavery. But even though some in the North argued that we should abolish slavery, Southern delegates basically said, who's going to pick the cotton? Our economy is based on a slave system. There's no way that we are going to enter into this new nation and agree to get rid of our slaves. So Southern delegates from South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, some from Virginia, argued very strongly that if this country, if delegates from the North were so intent on eliminating slavery, Southern states just would not join the country. They'd have to have 2 separate countries, a Southern nation and a Northern nation. And in the end, folks from the North felt it was more important to be unified, to have everybody together, than it was to get rid of slavery. So Northern delegates gave up their goal of totally eliminating slavery, and they reached a compromise, which becomes a very famous and controversial compromise that we look at today and we sort of don't understand, but this is the way it happened. The 3/5 Compromise is the name of it, and what it said is that Northern delegates, like Ben Franklin, got something that they wanted because the slave trade was set to end by 1820. So within 30 years of the signing of the Constitution, the slave trade would come to an end. There would be no more new slaves brought to this country from Africa or anywhere else. The other part of the compromise made the Southern states happy because it increased their representation in Congress. So the Southern states wanted to count slaves for the purpose of population. They wanted to say that because we have all of these slaves living in our states, we have a larger population and therefore more representation in the House of Representatives. Northern delegates didn't like that because the Southern delegates viewed their slaves as property, not people. And if they were going to count as property, Northern delegates felt they should be able to be taxed. So there was also an element of taxing Southern plantation owners on the slaves that they owned. So the 3/5 Compromise allowed slavery to continue. It allowed Southern states to count slaves as 3/5 of a person and gain increased representation in Congress. But it also allowed Northern delegates some satisfaction of being able to tax Southern plantation owners on the slaves that they owned, and that brought more money into the national government. So, the Great Compromise, the 3/5 Compromise are two important areas in which Northern and Southern delegates, delegates from large states and small states, had to put aside their differences in order to create a constitution. Ben Franklin said in the end that while he didn't think it was a perfect document, He thought that given all of the different interests and different goals and objectives of all the different men in the room, that this Constitution was about as well as they could have done. And it's lasted for more than 200 years, so there's a lot of good stuff in the Constitution, and it lays out how our government functions. We'll talk in a little bit in the next lecture about the difference between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Some people hated this Constitution and committed themselves to oppose it. Those are the Anti-Federalists. Federalists, like James Madison, were totally committed to the Constitution and were sure that nothing was more important than getting this Constitution officially in place as the law of the land. So the next topic we'll look at is the debate over ratification of the Constitution, which means are we going to accept it in each state? And that debate is going to be influenced by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Thanks for listening.